CEO of Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's event commemorating the 75th anniversary of the liberation of the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. We have some very special guests with us today. Eva Brettler is a Holocaust survivor who has shared her story with groups at the museum for many years. She was born in 1936 in Romania and was deported to Ravensbrück concentration camp in 1944. 75 years ago this month, Eva was liberated from Bergen-Belsen by British troops. I'll let Eva tell the rest of her remarkable story. Also with us today, all the way from London, is a good friend of the museum, Lord Daniel Finkelstein, who is a featured speaker at the museum's gala in 2018. Lord Finkelstein is associate editor, columnist, and senior writer for The Times. He sits in the House of Lords and is a member of the Prime Minister's Holocaust Commission. Lord Finkelstein is the grandson of the first archivist of the Holocaust, Dr. Alfred Wiener, and a patron of the Wiener Library, one of the world's leading and most extensive archives on the Holocaust. His mother, Mirjam Wiener, was a survivor of Bergen-Belsen. I'd also like to introduce the museum's board chair, Michele Gold. In addition to serving as board chair, Michele has been a docent at the museum for many years and is the author of Memories That Won't Go Away, a tribute to the children of the Kindertransport. Her mother, Rita Burwald, left Germany on a Kindertransport to the UK. After we hear from Eva and Lord Finkelstein, Michele will moderate a question and answer session with them. If you have a question for either speaker, please type them in the comment box. And now I'd like to hand it over to our featured speakers today. Thank you.
Thank you. I usually give a little background, and I start with my father. My father was one of 10 children, and my mother was one of 6 children. My father's name was Alexander, and my mother was Margit. They were both born, including myself, in Transylvania. That was a region which was annexed to Hungary in 1940. My father became a printer. He loved working with letters and numbers. And my mother became a hat maker. I still love beautiful hats, and I have quite a few of them. I am about 4.5 years old. My father comes home and let us know that he lost his job. I ask him, Papa, how is that possible? Last week they honored you as an outstanding worker. He says, I know, but I lost my job because we are Jewish. I knew that. But that was very confusing for a young child. My father had the foresight, and he said, let's move to a region where people do not know us. We had a beautiful little apartment, paintings, needle points hanging on the wall, which was handed down from generation. And we left everything behind. We collected a small little suitcase and we moved to Budapest, which is the capital of Hungary. The war was raging throughout Europe, and there was a tremendous shortage of apartments. My parents finally found a place where we got one room. In one room was our landlady, Mrs. Gross. In the other room was a single woman who became an SS woman. So you can see the diversity in one little apartment. Both of my parents found jobs, and I was sent to a little nursery school. We were extremely crowded. And one day my mother said, let me take you up to visit her mother, my maternal grandmother, who lived in a small little village called Tasnad. And I was absolutely fascinated. They were growing fruits and vegetables there. And I remember one day my grandmother breaking bread. And you know how the delicious aroma takes over the whole house. And she kind of spoiled me. She always had a small little piece ready for me before the big one was cut up. When there is tremendous banging on the door, I got scared. I hid behind my grandmother. 2 Hungarian policemen came in. They said, you have a half an hour, collect your belongings. We are taking you to a labor camp. When the door closed, my grandmother took out the bread and she turned to me. Your name is not on the list. I want you to hide in the cornfield. I said, Grandma, I'm too young. Don't leave me alone. She said to me, for a change, don't argue, but listen. She made sure I was well hidden. I remember my young aunt Iboya, who was home at the time. She hugged me and kissed me and said, please stay safe. We really love you and care for you. I watched as my grandmother and my young aunt joined the other people who were going toward the railroad station. I came out from my hiding place, and out of nowhere, a group of people surrounded me, and from their clothes, I recognized they were Romans. And I was told early on, be very cautious. They love to steal young children. So I pretended my grandma was inside. And I yelled, Grandma, Grandma, come on out. These people don't want to leave me alone. And wonder of wonders, they left. I felt so empowered that I fooled them. I did go to my hiding place. Eventually, my father arrived. I have no concept how much time lapsed. But my father was already wearing a yellow star. I did not have one. And he prepared me to go back to Budapest. I walked next to him. Eventually, we did make it. After our second try, we made it to the railroad station. And when we got there, young Aerocrossmen were yelling at my father, you dirty Jew, you cannot go inside the train. You will have to wait till the train is filled up and be on the open platform. My father said, I understand. He walked around trying to find somebody who would watch me, and seen a young woman with a small child and approached her and begged her. Could you please watch my daughter? She's a good girl. She will behave. And this lady was so courageous, because watching a Jewish child, she could have been arrested. The train was filled with soldiers. And when this lovely lady tried to give me something to eat, I was so petrified, I just couldn't swallow anything. When we arrived to Budapest, they held my father back and they let off the people first from the train. And the minute I got off, I started to run. I was so desperate to have my mama hold on to me. My father came, he was a little upset with me, and he had to go back the same night to the labor camp. On March 19, 1944, the Germans invaded Hungary. It was pretty late in the war, but in record time, the ghetto was established by April 1st. How could they do it so quickly? Because the local population collaborated with them to the highest degree. My mother didn't want to go into a ghetto. Somehow she got papers to a Swiss safe house. We stayed there for a while until the safe house was no longer accepted and it was closed down. My mother got papers to a Swedish safe house. A short time later, the same thing happened. While they were emptying the safe house, I was very small. My mother took me and put me inside a basket, and she put the basket on top of her furniture and put towels over me. And she told me, "You stay there till I come and get you." By the time she came to get me, I was soaking wet. I'm almost 8 years old. I was so embarrassed. My mother helped me to change my clothes, and we collected our belongings. And as we are ready to leave the safe house, a policeman who is standing guard there looks at my mother and says, "Move very, very quickly. I don't see you." So he basically saved us. We started to walk very fast. It was dark outside and there was a curfew. After a certain time, you couldn't be on the street. And as we were walking, my mother said, "I have such a big surprise for you. You will have a new last name. My maiden name is Katz. That's a very popular Jewish name. And my new name became, my fictitious name became Eva Nagy. And Nagy in Hungarian means big. So my mama said, "Now you really have to act like a big girl because your last name gives you the name also." And as we were walking, she made me practice my new name. And she said, "Where do you think we should go? We cannot be on the street." And then she remembered that the SS woman's brother used to bring me little gifts, and we did visit him before. And we decided to go to his place. When we knocked on his door, he let us in. The following day, it was beautiful, sunny, really, really warm outside. It was in September. And my mother said, "Under your new name, I will enroll you to school." I never attended school before because my birthday is end of November. And I was excited. I will be going to school. And they actually accepted me under my fictitious name. And we even found a new place where we could stay. But my mother decided to go back for the few belongings we left there. And as we approached this man's place, we are ready to knock on his door. 2 policemen arrested us. They knew our real name. We were taken first to a police station. From a police station, we were taken to a brick factory. The brick factory was like a holding place. Most people had with them additional clothes, food. All we had the light summer clothes we were wearing. And my mother had heels on. And we started on the forced labor march toward Germany. The march was very, very difficult. Every so often they put some of the children on wagon. And when we arrived to our temporary destination, we were reunited. One day my mother's feet were so badly swollen and bleeding. And she came with me and begged, could I please get on the wagon with my daughter? They put me on. They pushed my mother away. A short time later, we heard shots. When we arrived to our destination, I went to the place where we were supposed to reunite. My mother never came. I was crying. I'm not 8 yet. And one of the ladies who was coordinating things there, she said, maybe your mother escaped. I'm going to watch you. I remember the bombing was so heavy that the whole sky was lighted up. Eventually, we were pushed into a cattle wagon. The cattle wagon, when it stopped, we were informed we arrived to Ravensbrück. Ravensbrück was a women's camp, and over 4/5 of the population perished there. I arrived to Ravensbrück on January 1945. The process they put us through was extremely cruel. My hair was shaven and all my clothes taken away. When I came out from the place where they shaved my hair and they gave me the new uniform to wear, when I came out, I stood in the corner. An older lady noticed me there and she said, young girl, how come you don't go to your barrack? I said, I don't belong to anyone. She said, from now on, you belong to me. And she held on to me. And she became like my mentor, amazing. She and I ended up in the barrack. It had bunk beds, no mattresses, no cover. And in January, it's extremely cold there. Our daily routine was basically walking around the campground. The Soviet army was approaching the camp, and the camp was being liquidated. We were pushed back in a cattle wagon. And this time, on March 1945, I arrived to Bergen-Belsen. The first thing I seen when we got off the cattle wagon were big mountains of corpses. This time they assigned us to a barrack. We no longer had bunk beds. The conditions were very, very bad. One day, as we were walking around the campground, somebody noticed that behind the kitchen area, there was a pile of potato peels. And they told me to go under the fence, which had an opening, to bring out some potato peels. I did as I was told, got a little scratched up. They grabbed the potato peels so quickly from me, I never had a chance to put one in my mouth. The second time, the same. On the third time, I sat there and ate potato peels before I brought out. One day, there was tremendous talking going around, and I overheard that a truckload of children were saved. These children were the so-called diamond children, and they were going to collect ransom for them. And this lady's name is Luba. And they called her the Angel of Bergen-Belsen. I kind of wanted to be together with her. but I couldn't. Thank you. But I couldn't go to another barrack. But I was so anxious to be together with Luba. One day it looked beautiful, sunny out, and I sneaked out from my barrack, and the sun was blinding me. And somebody approached me and picked me up. I could see tears in the man's eyes, but I couldn't make out too much about his clothes. And as he put me down, he reached in his pocket and gave me a chocolate bar. It was April 15, 1945, and we were liberated by the British. That chocolate bar I ate all by myself. A few days later, I became so sick, I said, that's the penalty for not sharing my chocolate bar. And eventually I developed very high fever, and they were leading me to the hospital, which was established by the British. And just as I'm ready to go in, our landlady, Mrs. Gross, sees me. And she says, Eva, I'm going to wait for you and take you back to Budapest. I said, thank you, Mrs. Gross. I don't plan on ever going back to Budapest. I'm pretty sure my mother was killed, and probably so was my father. I have a chance to go to Sweden. And guess what? I'm going to live in the king's castle. Well, I came down with typhus. It had nothing to do with my chocolate bar. And miraculously, on August 1945, I sailed on a big Navy ship to Sweden. Guess what? They never took me to the king's castle, but I ended up in an orphanage. And in that orphanage was Luba, who became like all mothers. Most of the children there were Polish. I had to learn how to speak Polish, Swedish, and German, and I forgot Hungarian. One day I was summoned into the principal's office, and the principal told me my father survived. And through the International Red Cross, they found me. So in January 1947, I went back to Hungary. I didn't know how to speak Hungarian. I understood, but I could not utter a word. And my father informed me, I have a new mother and a new little brother. Chronologically, I just turned 10. But world experience-wise, I was quite a bit older. I had some difficulty adjusting. In October, skipping a little forward, in October 1956, a Hungarian revolution broke out. And during that revolution, the chaos that followed was very, very scary. And anti-Semitism really skyrocketed. And I told my parents, I'm leaving Hungary, and I ended up crossing the border between Hungary to Austria. I studied in a technical school chemistry, and President Eisenhower had a special program who studied science, and by January 1957, I arrived to USA. And my new mother had a brother, and his family greeted me. Those days you could come to the airplane, and I was greeted like a little queen, so many people welcoming me to Los Angeles. I started to speak in around 2007 about my stories. I was told when I came back, don't talk about your experience. And by fortunately meeting Dr. Sarah Moscovich and Flo Kinsler, I ended up joining a support group, which were children who were children during the Holocaust. And that was the first time we were kind of encouraged to share our story. I speak many times to students, and I have been speaking at the museum. My reason for sharing my story is for multiple reasons. I have been extremely fortunate. I met Elie Wiesel several times. And Elie Wiesel states that every Holocaust survivor's obligation is to share their story. The other reason, so many people claim the Holocaust never happened. When I look at the young students and people who I speak to, I ask them to become my future ambassadors and make sure that our stories of our loved one isn't forgotten. The other reason, that little 8-year-old child could have never survived without the compassion of total strangers. I have been very fortunate. With my late husband and I, we have 4 children. All our kids received a higher education, and they also give back to the community. And finally, I hope that you all keep hope as your companion and don't allow hatred to ruin your life. Thank you so much for your attention.
Eva, thank you. I'm fighting through a puddle of tears here as I now introduce Daniel Finkelstein. Daniel.
Thank you. I'm not sure that I'm used to being introduced by someone saying that they have to have a puddle of tears when they introduce me. But that is the only possible response to that extraordinary story. And thank you so much for sharing it. We all felt honoured to hear it. And every part of it was so brilliantly and clearly told. We're really lucky to have your courage to be a witness in that way. Thank you also for inviting me to speak once again to the museum, albeit in this rather unexpected way. And a friend sent me an email last week saying he'd been scheduled to give a lecture in Harvard this week, and he would still be addressing the university online. Would I like to attend? And I wrote back saying that ordinarily I'd have loved to, but I couldn't attend his address in Boston because at that time I'd be speaking in Los Angeles. Here I am, and just over a week ago was the anniversary of the liberation of Belsen. And each year this is a poignant moment for me because Belsen is where my mother and my aunts starved and suffered, and Belsen is where my grandmother weakened from disease and hunger. And Belsen is the reason she ultimately died. And this year, however, has a special significance for me, and not just because it was the 75th, it was because I've learned so much in the last 12 months about why my mother was there and how she came to survive, and I'd like to share it with you, if I may. Let me start with this. When the British arrived in Belsen, they encountered an horrific scene. Piles of dead bodies, thousands and thousands of sick and dying people, a smell of decay and decomposition beyond description. And I received many messages from people who numbered among their family those who liberated the camp. And many say their relatives and never spoke about it, and that sometimes decades later they would happen upon their father or their uncle and find them crying about that experience. And so to each of those correspondents, I make sure to send a message of thanks from my family for what they did and the burden they as families carry. As we work together to help the museum, we preserve the story of the victims of Belsen, but also of these liberators, and we preserve their truth so that people understand a little of their experience. When the end came in Belsen, my mother was no longer there. And the reason, which has only now just been discovered, was really quite remarkable. And I want to tell you that story. I'd better start at the beginning, which, as Julie Andrews correctly said, is the very best place to start. My mother, Mirjam Wiener, was the youngest daughter of one of the organizers of the German anti-Nazi movement, its archivist and propagandist, Alfred Wiener. Alfred had been collecting material about the activities of the Nazis in secret since 1928. It became one of the greatest sources of information about National Socialism in the world. He'd been using the material he collected to try to warn the German middle class, but to no avail. Memorably, he once went to see the chief advisor to Chancellor von Papen to explain the nature of fascism, and back came the reply: Hitler is basically well-meaning, if a little excitable. In 1933, after a harrowing meeting with Goering, Alfred moved his library and his family from Berlin and established them all in Amsterdam. There they formed part of a small German Jewish refugee community, along with others such as Otto Frank and his family. They were part of the same synagogue, they attended the same schools. Margot Frank and my mother's sister Ruth were in class together and were friends at Hader. Recently, looking at a school photo of my mother, I realized it had been taken by the same photographer with the same background as the famous contemporary photograph of Anne Frank. And you can see these photos side by side with the same background and the same pose. But Amsterdam was precarious. Its government was nervous about offending the Germans. It felt vulnerable to invasion, and the Dutch Prime Minister was sufficiently concerned that he intervened personally to seek changes to Alfred Wiener's publications to ensure they were less offensive to the Germans. And Alfred soon realized he'd have to move again. So he shipped his archive to Britain and opened the library in London on the day war broke out in September 1939. His family, his wife and 3 girls, his wife's sister and her family were still in Amsterdam, and they were hesitant about moving because my grandmother Margarita did not want to leave her sister. The details are a bit confused, but the bottom line is that the visas for my grandmother and her girls to leave did not arrive until it was too late to use them, and they were trapped in Holland. In 1943, Margarita and the girls were arrested and sent to Westerbork, and so was Margarita's sister and her family, and this is where the remarkable part of the story begins. From Westerbork, Jewish families were sent east to their deaths with weekly transports. This is the fate that awaited my mother's aunt and her uncle and her cousin, but not my mother. After a year, my mother and her sisters and my grandmother were sent to Bergen-Belsen to be in the Star Camp, where exchanges were supposed to take place, so called because people had to wear a large star, where in fact tens of thousands of people died and almost nobody was exchanged at all. From the beginning, from early 1944 when they arrived, Belsen was a terrible place, freezing cold all the time, with almost no food, impossibly hard for an adult, impossibly frightening and boring for a child. But difficult though it is to believe, things got worse. From the summer of 1944, the camp began to collapse. It didn't have the facilities to cope with thousands of new inmates brought from elsewhere, as we've just heard, as the Germans retreated and sought to cover up their crimes. Soon there was no water at all, hardly any food, even less than the miserable amount given out before, inadequate toilet facilities, disease spread, starvation became almost universal. Belsen was an extermination camp by the end, just with different means of eradication. So the chance to leave was a life-changing and life-saving chance. And it fell to my mother, to her sisters and my grandmother, because they had a Paraguayan passport. This document was almost certainly responsible for them being sent to Belsen rather than to the gas chambers. And then by luck, it saw them also selected for an exchange. Himmler had wanted to do many thousands of exchanges for Germans living abroad for money and for equipment, but his terms were so unrealistic that in the end, only a few hundred ever made it, and my mother was one of them. At the end of January 1945, my grandmother was informed that she and the girls were to be on a transport exchanged for Germans living in Allied occupied countries. The Paraguayan passports meant that they were eligible as citizens of a country the Nazis did not occupy. All they had to do was pass a simply physical test. And here is the Paraguayan passports, which I shall talk about in a moment. To walk past a group of guards, the Nazis did not want to send anyone who might show how sick people were in Belsen. Somehow my grandmother, starving as she was, managed to walk past this panel. And it was the greatest act of courage and determination, but she did make it. The family was given a shower. They naturally dreaded what would come out, but it was water. And then they were given a meal and set off on a journey to freedom that would last a week. At one point, the Nazis concluded they had too many people for the exchange. They told the Wiener family to get off. Perhaps death would come to them anyway. But when my Aunt Ruth explained that her mother was too sick to move, the guard simply shrugged, said stay then, and went to the next carriage. So they made it to Switzerland, my family of Paraguayans. And that night, my grandmother died. She'd seen her girls to freedom. And the news was telegraphed to my grandfather working in New York on supplies for his library. Your girls are safe, but your wife has died. Can you imagine his mixture of emotions as he read it? That thought, it is hard to bear. And that is the telegram that he received. But I've always wondered what on earth the Paraguayan passport was. It states that Margarita Wiener, my grandmother, came from Paraguay, which she most certainly did not. And as far as I know, there is and never has been any link at all between our family and Paraguay. But now I have found out. I did know the passport was obtained in Bern, in Switzerland, by a friend of my grandfather's. And as you can see from this document, the document is from the Conseil de la République de Paraguay à Bern. What I did not know, because it wasn't generally known, was that it came from a brave and successful effort by a group of Poles to save thousands of Jews. The Bern embassy of Poland was occupied not by the Polish government that had been taken over by the Soviets, but by the Polish government in exile under the ambassadorship of a man called Alexander Wadosz. A group working for him and with an exiled Polish politician and Zionist called Abraham Silberschein began to buy blank Paraguayan and other South American passports and fill them out with the details of Jews, claiming falsely that they came from Paraguay. My mother's passport, as you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, is signed by a man called Rudolf Hugili. He was Paraguay's honorary consul in Bern and sold the blanks and then signed them once they'd been filled out. He was apparently well paid. Silbersheim and Chaim Eiss provided the finance. The writing on the passport, quite distinctive, is the Polish embassy in Switzerland, quite distinctive is, as the Polish embassy in Switzerland has informed me, that of Konstanty Rzycki, one of the embassy team. Julius Hull and Ladosz's deputy, Stefan Rysnikwik, made up the rest of what is called the Wadosz Group. Buried behind the Iron Curtain, little has been known about this extraordinary effort, But this isn't going to change now, I think. A Vados list has been assembled with thousands of beneficiaries on it, many of them survivors of the war. A documentary has been made, and there are books to come by one of the authors. Roger Morehouse has written brilliantly on the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and he's now going to write on this. And I have plenty to learn from such a book because there's much I still do not know. But this I do know. Without the Vados group, my mother would not have survived. She would have gone to Auschwitz or Sobibor, or in the extraordinarily unlikely case that she went to Belsen, she would have died of disease and hunger in the last months in that camp. As it was, my grandmother starved to death, as I've said, on the night of freedom. But these heroes saved my grandmother's little girl. My mother lived a long life and a happy one. She married a Pole, a survivor of Siberia, by the way, and one whose father had been at school with Alexander Vados, which is an extraordinary coincidence. And some people with their experience see Hitler in everything. My mother and father saw things differently. Their experience helped them gain a sense of proportion, and they never argued with the neighbour about a hedge. They never quit the synagogue council in a row. They considered it out of the question to disapprove of their children's choice of partner. They took pleasure in the small things and admired their adopted country and liberty under the law. Their life together was, in my view anyway, a triumph, as peaceful and content as their story was turbulent and terrifying. So, thank you for listening. And later today, let's all of us raise a glass to the brave people in this story and renew our determination to preserve their memory and document their truth. And from my mother, whom you see here, I give you my thanks for listening to her story. Thank you.
Thank you. And before we get to questions, I just want to say thank you, Eva. Thank you for sharing your story with us. It's always a privilege to hear from you, to learn from you. You inspire all of us. Thank you. And to you, Lord Finkelstein, for your powerful and extensive presentation and for generously extending your time out of your very, very busy schedule to speak to us. Thank you from all of us. So I'm now going to go to we've got a slew of questions here. The first one is for Eva. Eva, were you able to keep any items or photos from your childhood?
The only item I saved was my ring when I came to Ravensbrück, and I hid it under my tongue. And when I was in Sweden, unfortunately, one day I washed my hand and the ring slipped off and I lost it in the drain. And I was so devastated. And Luba told me it's not a personal possession that carries on the memory. You will keep it on your heart as long as you live. My pictures I have is through my aunt, my mother's younger sister, Blanca, who had pictures of my mother and the family. And because of that, I'm one of the fortunate ones to have a picture of my family.
Thank you, Eva. To Daniel, I have a question. How do you think being a child of a survivor influenced your childhood and influenced the choices of your life?
Well, there are two different answers here. My parents were quite keen that it shouldn't overshadow our childhood. They were very keen to tell their story, but because my father was a survivor of Siberia as well, to tell their stories, but they wanted us to know them and to understand them, but they didn't want us to have to live there. My mother always said, I've been to these places, so you don't have to go. And that was very important to her. But it did shape my politics and my public life. My grandmother had this very, this is my father's mother. She had this statement, which I love, which was, while the Queen is safe in Buckingham Palace, we're safe in Hendon Central. We used to live in a small suburb of London called Hendon Central. And I've always believed very strongly in the kind of power of small, moderate reform. I believe very strongly in the rule of law. I've been very resistant to demagogues, to extremism, and I pursue a political life, both as a writer and as a participant, with the main aim of trying to ensure a life of stability and peace in liberty for my fellow citizens, and especially for my fellow Jews. So it's been profoundly important to me in that way.
Thank you. And I have a general question here and that is, do we know approximately how many Allied troops visited Bergen-Belsen at liberation and witnessed the conditions of the camp?
I don't know the answer.
Eva?
I don't know the answer to that question for certain. Maybe Eva does, but maybe you even do, Michele.
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah. But what I do know, just to say that I do not know numerically. I do know how struck I am by the number of people who have relatives who had that experience. I think it was thousands of people, because people were not allowed to stay for very long. Yeah. The idea was that the experience was so difficult, they had to leave after a couple of days. So I think quite a few troops did. I think it was thousands rather than tens.
Yes, thank you, thank you. And another general question, and that is, upon liberation, where were the malnourished and the starved survivors taken to be brought back to good health? And then this, and the second part of the question is, my mother was liberated from Bergen-Belsen in her oral history tape. It sounded like she was taken to Belsen Hospital. Are you aware of this hospital?
I also was in Belsen Hospital. I have a documents which shows all the places I was. And the hospital I was taken, it was Belsen. Bergen-Belsen was one of the few camps the British had to set on fire because it was so infested with all kinds of bacteria and virus that they had to burn it down. So most people were moved out from Bergen-Belsen very fast. I don't have the dates, but you have to realize I was so young that for me to remember dates, it's a little bit overwhelming. But I have looked up quite a bit of information, and I've seen that Bergen-Belsen was one of the few places that they had to burn down.
Thank you.
Can I just add that 14,000 people, Michele, died after the liberation of Belsen. Right. And actually what you said about eating the chocolate, some of the people died because they ate, right. You know, and some people died because of typhus or scarlet fever.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I've just got a question in from Daniel, and that is, how did you find the passport? And do you think your mother was aware of it?
Oh, so she knew about the passport. We've always had the passport. What she didn't know, or at least she certainly didn't say, and I'm pretty sure she didn't know, is where it came from. None of us really knew where it came from. It's always been a bit of a mystery to me. And this research has been done only this year by the Jakob Kumosh, who became the ambassador of Switzerland, Poland to Switzerland, and became interested in his predecessor. The Poles are quite interested in their own Holocaust history, partly because it's quite controversial, and so he did this piece of work and uncovered this news, and I only found out about it because during the anniversary this year of my mother's release from Belsen, which came at the end of January, I just used social media to tweet about her journey every day. And somebody actually replied to me, did your mother get these passports from Switzerland? Well, that was the one thing I knew about them, that they came from Switzerland. And then I was told the story. So this story has only been discovered in the last 9 months.
Oh, wow. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, Daniel. Thank you. And I've just got one that came in for Eva, and that is, do you know what happened to the woman who took care of you in the camp?
Well, unfortunately, my tante died in Ravensbrück. I had short time, so I didn't share a lot of stories. And my tante was holding on to me at night, her arms wrapped around me, and was teaching me little prayers. And one night we woke up and we heard a baby cry. And it was so unusual because there were no babies in the barrack. And the other woman in the barrack said the baby was born during the night. You cannot tell anyone, you have to keep it a secret. And we are going to save both the mother and the baby. And I remember turning to my lovely tante and asking her, do you think I will ever become a mother? Do you think I can ever have children? And she said to me, you have to promise me you keep hope your companion. And you have to realize that little 8-year-old girl couldn't have survived without the compassion of total strangers. And that lovely tante also unfortunately didn't make it, but she is in my heart for the rest of my life.
Thank you, Eva. And I have about 4 or 5 almost identical questions for you. And that is, how do students react when they hear your story today, especially students who may not have learnt much about the Holocaust before they've met you?
The first time I went with a friend, and many of you know her, Natalie Gold, and it was to El Monte. And she was going to speak there. And before she spoke, they put me on to share my story. And a young girl who was at the time 10 years old, after hearing my story, she said, I want you to know, my father was killed because they said he was part of a gang, which wasn't true. And he was killed in front of our house. And you are giving me the courage to move on in life. I got that from a 10-year-old girl before I even started to talk. And that gave me the incentive to say yes many times, to be able to. And the kids, I usually give them a homework. The little girl in me is still missing her mother. And I ask them, when you go home, please let your loved ones know how much they mean to you. And they seem so grateful, and they promise me they will carry on the memory of my story.
Thank you, Eva. And I have possibly a complex question for Daniel, and that is anti-Semitism in UK and Europe today. Can you share a little of your thoughts?
Yes. So I've always been fairly optimistic about it, but I must admit the last 2 or 3 years did shake that faith quite a lot. There was a sort of rise in something which one might call a kind of anti-imperialist left, which decided that its focus was really Israel, and which also harked back to a lot of tropes about banker capitalism, and in combination, that meant that, particularly using social media and other things, there was a sort of confluence between a conspiracy theorist right and some of its kind of ideas about Holocaust denial and Israel being involved in 9/11, and an anti-imperialist left who made increasingly Zionism as its core. And that has been, for the first time, I think, a pretty disconcerting fact for Jews in Britain. But it has to be said, we've turned a bit of a corner. The Labour Party lost the last election partly because of this issue, and it turned out people did care about it. And as a result, the Labour Party's response has been to turn to a leadership determined to do something about it. So I'm more optimistic now than if you'd asked me this question 9 months ago.
Thank you. And I have a very interesting question for either one to answer or both to answer. And that is, how do you believe the story of the Holocaust generally, on your own stories in particular, will be told in 50 years' time?
Well, in my case, I'm fortunate that just like you wrote a story on your mother's, on the kinder transport, our child survivor group ended up writing a book, How We Survived. And that book has been around for quite a few universities, and school use that as their teaching, helpful with the teaching of the Holocaust. I have noticed quite a few people from the second and third generation who stepped in. And Bet probably remembers, and maybe you too, last year, when it was Yom HaShoah at the park. It was my young grandson, who I forgot to mention, I'm a proud grandmother, was helping us to tell about my story. So I hope that the future generation, not only our children, but I have many, many students who interviewed me, and I still keep in touch with them. And I hope they will carry on the memory of what happened during the Holocaust, because it can be forgotten. That's my input.
Thank you.
Well, here's two things. One is I'm determined to tell my mother's story. I regard that as now something that I need to do, and I'm contemplating. It's quite a big and a rather daunting task, writing a book about it, but I will certainly be speaking about it to audiences like yours, but also to lots of other audiences in Britain. But the other thing that we can do is support organisations like the LA Museum. It's such a valuable thing. I was so moved when I came to see it. It was such a brilliant way in which you've managed to tell the story, such a good narrative sense, such extraordinary exhibits, and telling a universal story, but also rooted in the experience of the survivors that live in the area. So something that people can really relate to. I was very moved by that, and I've added it to one of the key organizations to help as we try to ensure there are institutions that preserve the memory of the Holocaust. And I hope everyone who's listening will feel they want to play their part in doing that.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you very, very much. And I cannot tell you how much we appreciate you and the contribution that you have made to our museum. It's absolutely invaluable, and we treasure it. And profuse thank yous to you. And to both you and Eva, we again thank you both so much. This has been an incredible session. I hope our viewers have cherished it as much as we all have. And on behalf of the Los Angeles Museum of the Holocaust, we thank you both profusely. Thank you so much. Before we sign off, I do want to let you know that while the museum is closed, we are regularly providing virtual programs. And our next one is on April 27th at 4 p.m. Pacific time. So please do join us for a virtual tour of our current temporary exhibit called Objects from the Concentration Camps, with photographer Richard Wiesel, who will join us live from Australia. He is a cousin of Elie Wiesel, and he was granted exclusive access to the closed archives of the concentration camp memorials at Sachsenhausen and Ravensbrück to photograph artifacts that have never been seen before publicly. Working with a German historian, Richard was able to connect the artifacts, personal items that belonged to the prisoners at the camps to their former owners. On Tuesday, Richard will share his photographs and explain what it was like for him to photograph these precious artifacts and what he hopes we will take away from the exhibit. So you can find more about the information and our virtual events on this Facebook page or on our website, lamoth.org. So from all of us to Eva, to Daniel, enormous thanks again. And we cannot thank you both enough. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.